सबभन्दा त पहिले सबैलाई शुभ सन्ध्या टक्राउन चाहन्छु र म नेपाली भाषामै यो सेसनको सञ्चालन गर्ने यहाँहरूबाट अनुमति पनि चाहन्छु। म विलम्ब नगरिकन सेसनको प्रारम्भ गर्न गइरहेको छु। सबभन्दा पहिले त आजको यस विकेन्द्रीकृत शासन प्रणालीमा समावेशीकरण विषयको तेस्रो थिम अन्तर्गतको दोस्रो सत्रको अध्यक्षता गर्ने अवसर प्रदान गर्नुभएकोमा काठमाडौँ विश्वविद्यालय स्कुल अफ ल प्रति हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त गर्न चाहन्छु। समावेशीकरणको महत्त्वको विषयमा यस किसिमको सम्मेलन हुनुमा राम्रो सुरुवात भएको पनि मैले लिएकी छु। राज्यको संविधान ऐन कानुनमा समावेशिताको विषयलाई स्पष्ट रूपमा उल्लेख गरिएको र हरेक तह र तबकाबाट तदर्पताका साथ कार्यान्वयन गरिँदै आएको विषयमा हामी सबै जानकार नै छौँ। यस किसिमको अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय सम्मेलनका माध्यमबाट विभिन्न देशका असल अभ्यासबाट हामीले थप जानकारी प्राप्त गर्ने मौका पाउँछौँ भने जसले समावेशिताको कार्यान्वयनलाई सशक्त बनाउन मद्दत गर्दछ। र आजको यस कार्यक्रममा अघि नै उद्घोषकज्यूले उद्घोष गरिसक्नु भएको छ। विज्ञहरूबाट कार्यपत्र प्रस्तुति, टिप्पणीकर्ताहरूबाट टिप्पणी प्रस्तुत भइसकेपछि सहभागीहरूको जिज्ञासा लिने र जिज्ञासा उप सम्बन्धित प्रस्तोताबाट सम्बोधन भई कार्यक्रमको ऱ्यापअप सहित समापन हुने जानकारी गराउँदै हामी माझ अस्ट्रेलिया मेलबोर्न विश्वविद्यालय अन्तर्गतको स्कुल अफ सोसल एन्ड पोलिटिकल साइन्स फ्याकल्टी अफ आर्ट्स पब्लिक पोलिसी लेक्चरर डाक्टर माइकल जी ब्रेन र ओस्लो नर्वेका निर्वाचन विज्ञ मिस्टर कारे भोलान पेपर प्रस्तुतकर्ताको रूपमा रहनुभएको छ भने त्यसै गरी हामीसँग दुईजना टिप्पणीकर्ताहरूमा मलाई जानकारी प्राप्त भएअनुसार प्रधानमन्त्री तथा मन्त्री परिषद कार्यालयका सहसचिव रेखा दासज्यू, त्यसै गरी फिलिपिन्स विश्वविद्यालयको तुलनात्मक सरकार र राजनीतिक विषयका प्राध्यापक श्री मिरियम कोरोनल-फेरर हुनुहुन्छ। म अब प्रस्तोताज्यूहरूलाई आफ्नो प्रस्तुति अगाडि बढाउनको लागि अनुरोध गर्दै पहिलो प्रस्तुति अस्ट्रेलिया मेलबोर्नका विश्वविद्यालयका लेक्चरर डाक्टर माइकल जी ब्रेनलाई आमन्त्रण गर्न चाहन्छु। उहाँको प्रस्तुतिको विषय Political parties in federal system in Asia, Intraparty democracy and deliberation in ethnic and multi-ethnic parties. एसियाका सङ्घीय प्रणालीहरूमा राजनीतिक दलहरू, जातीय बहुजातीय दलहरूमा अन्तर्दल लोकतन्त्र र विचार विमर्श रहेको छ। Dr. Michael, the floor is yours. Please complete your presentation within 15 minutes.
Namaste, मेरा नाम Michael Ho. Bata the University of Melbourne, Tara Ali Nepali Bolchu. So from now on, I will speak English. Thank you very much to the conference organisers and to everyone for sticking around on what has been a very long day. My presentation today is about internal democracy in political parties. Looking at political parties in Asia, for which I've chosen 4 case studies. Nepal is one of those. So I'm looking at how different types of parties differ, and with a particular focus on how ethnic parties manage or not manage ethnic division and other forms of diversity. So I'm seeking to address a problem associated with democratization and federalization in Asia, and it's a problem that is associated with democracy generally in diverse societies. So fundamentally, democracy is harder in large and diverse societies. One prominent former political philosopher would say democracy can only work in small and homogeneous states. But the US innovation of federalism and representative democracy provided ways for this to happen. And today we see that all large and long-standing democracies in the world are federal, and federalism now covers around 40% of the world's population. But the US didn't have to deal with this issue of ethnic diversity. And so the assumed decision-making rule that applies in most democracies, which is really about a majority and majority rule, is problematic in ethnically diverse societies because you don't always get cycling majorities, you get permanent marginalisation of minority groups. So we want to look at how, different ways of making decisions, and one of the ways that you can make decisions differently is by using a more deliberative approach, so looking at deliberative democracy. So I wanted to look at how political parties work internally and whether they are deliberative in practice and what level of intra-party democracy that they do have. So there's a couple of premises to my investigation. One is that federal systems in Asia combine ethnic and multi-ethnic parties. So a lot of theories would say that once you have ethnic parties, that is all you will end up with. But in most countries in Asia that are very diverse, like this country, you will find combinations of those two. And I think it was a particularly fruitful combination in the 2008 Constituent Assembly election here. The second is that deliberative democracy has been demonstrated to moderate ethnic politics and reduce extremism, so it reduces conflict. So I want to look at how different parties compare. So there's been a lot of discussion about the implementation of federalism, how it relies on the people to make it work. One of the earliest comparative studies of federalism by William Rekha in 1964 determined that political party system is the key variable determining how federalism works. So if you have a centralised political party system, you will have a centralised federal system. So some argue that having political parties, which we would generally accept as essential parts of democracy today, undermines deliberation. So we have legislatures that are designed to be places for deliberation, but partisan politics tends to have political parties come in with very fixed positions and they are unwilling to change their minds, or at least unwilling to be seen to change their minds. And so you don't have that deliberation in legislatures. So if you look to political parties, do you find deliberation there? One study has shown that there is a lot of deliberation in political parties, and people reflect on things and they change their minds, and there's a lot of deliberative capacity as well. We also have some work that shows that smaller parties are more democratic and deliberative. And I've also written about federalism in Asia providing that space for ethnic and multi-ethnic parties to help compete and hold each other to account. So my research explored two hypotheses. One is that multi-ethnic parties have institutional conditions that are more conducive to democratic deliberation than ethnic parties. And the second is that parties are more deliberative in practice at the local level than at the national level. So my methodology was essentially coding a representative sample of political party constitutions or statutes in multi-ethnic states with federal systems in Asia, and then identifying and clarifying the internal practices of deliberation and other approaches to decision-making in a subset of those political parties through interviews and other primary sources. So my four cases are Malaysia, Myanmar, India, and Nepal. And the party statute coding can be disaggregated into four different areas. One relates to deliberation, another relates to voting. Then we also have decentralization and inclusion. I interviewed, I think it was around 70 or 80 interviews with political party members and political party leaders in each of those four countries. And this is what I'm presenting here as preliminary results. There's some more quantitative work to do with the political party coding, but I think that there's some important insights coming out already that I'm very happy to share and would love some questions on. So firstly, with regard to the difference of how political parties operate in practice and their party statutes and rules, I find that there isn't really that much difference. They usually do try and follow them, but it makes the times and the reasons that they do not all the more important. Like, for example, political leaders continually postponing a party congress against the rules because their leadership is on the line. They know what the outcome of those votes will be, and I think the Nepali colleagues here will know some examples. I did find support for the idea that political parties are more open and deliberative at the lower levels, whether at the branch level of large parties or within small and regional parties. I also found that the issue of candidate selection is quite problematic, as it is idealised in the political party statutes, but it's limited by, one is the availability of candidates. So in several other places, many of the seats didn't really have much competition in pre-selection because of the cost, so there wasn't much funding available for running in non-metropolitan seats, for example. And so this meant that candidates would see running for political office as an investment, and therefore they need a return on that investment once they get in, and this leads to political patronage and corruption. And secondly, no matter how bottom-up the process is and how many rights the provinces and the local levels have, there is almost always a vetting and a veto right at the central level in practice. I think this is one of the key findings as relates to Nepal in particular. There was almost an unquestioned centralisation of candidate selection, even at the local level. And political leaders that I spoke to were very, very open that we directly select local government candidates in important constituencies, and we select provincial level candidates. And I think that this would be almost unheard of in most federal countries. When it comes to the difference between ethnic and multi-ethnic parties, there is ambiguity on one side. Overtly ethnic parties are at least open about who they represent, but multi-ethnic parties often purport to represent all groups, but in fact they're the parties of the dominant ethnic group. I've got a couple of quotes up here from Malaysia. I feel this is a party that proclaims its multi-ethnicity and that it's a party for everyone. And they say, I feel more comfortable with a Muslim leader. I know they understand my feeling. Oh, but I have no other problem with any other religions and they're all part of our party. But clearly they are favouring one particular group in their policies. People wanted to move away from communal politics, but the policies are still communal, and so this sort of forced them into taking this ethnic approach to policies. In terms of deliberation, a few parties outlined specific deliberative practices in their statutes. The Democratic Action Party in Malaysia, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and the Shan National League for Democracy in Myanmar all had explicit rules and requirements for deliberation, including that all members and delegates are entitled to speak, rules for the manner or form of speech, and that speakers get a right of reply. There is also an apparent trade-off or objective to reach decisions through deliberation and consensus building rather than other voting-based internal democratic procedures. So, in other words, those that rely more on voting for positions and platforms can be seen to be less deliberative, and those that emphasise deliberation in their procedures and practices don't need to rely on voting. I've given an example of the Democratic Action Party, and they extend it. They require speakers must be confined to the topic at hand, time limits to ensure equal opportunity, and so on. And the aim is therefore that people agree and no vote is needed. Now, the question, I guess, is the extent to what does this actually mask an authoritarian approach, a centralisation in political parties. They say we are deliberative and we aim for consensus, but in fact, it's dominant actors forcing others to compromise. For example, one Nepali political party would say that, yeah, we deliberate on all the policies, but in the end, all the decisions are made by the big three people. So when quantifying the results, the differences between ethnic parties and multi-ethnic parties is actually quite stark. Multi-ethnic parties come out on average as considerably more deliberative. So ethnic parties are the ones on the left and multi-ethnic parties on the right. And you can see that multi-ethnic parties come out 85% more deliberative, 46% more democratic, 26% more decentralised, and 159% more inclusive. There are differences between countries, as displayed here, but these don't diminish the significant differences in rules and operation of ethnic and multi-ethnic parties. Now you can note Nepal here on the far right. It comes out very poorly on voting, very, very poorly on decentralisation, and it comes out well on inclusion, and this is because we see inclusion mandated in a lot of the political party rules. But otherwise, from a comparative perspective, against three other countries that are not renowned for their democracy, from a comparative perspective, Nepal's political parties are not very democratic at all. When it comes to the size of the party, there are important similarities that in some respect are more important than whether they're ethnic or multi-ethnic. Here we can see that there's not much difference between large parties when they're multi-ethnic or ethnic. Medium-sized parties is not so significant either. But when it comes to small parties, the difference is substantial. Small ethnic parties are the most undemocratic on the 4 dimensions out of all the subcategories, averaging 1.4 compared to average of 6 of the small multi-ethnic parties. So this is an important finding. It supports the hypothesis that smaller parties are more likely to be deliberative and internally democratic, but only if they're multi-ethnic. So to sum up, the research has supported the hypotheses with that qualification. The ethnic parties are not very democratic or deliberative, even when they're small and operate only at the local level, but there are some exceptions. But I want to emphasise that this does not mean that ethnic parties are not important parts of federal systems in Asia. They provide forms of representation that can ameliorate the likelihood of ethnic minorities finding alternative or violent means of representing their rights. They can hold power in provinces and at the local level in their own right and invigorate federalism in this way. They can help to hold large multi-ethnic parties to account and form coalitions at the centre and bring ethnic issues to the table. Further, I think as ethnic parties become more institutionalised, it's likely they will become less personality-based. The other important conclusion is there's sometimes a trade-off between the voting forms of democracy and deliberative forms. It's hard to address the concerns. If the party can address concerns through deliberation and reach consensus, voting is not as important, but it's harder the larger the party is. The Democratic Action Party in Malaysia really stood out for its focus on deliberation, and it also is one of the leading voices of moderation in Malaysian politics. And my final point would be to echo some of the words of Mohandas Mananda, and to finally that for federalism to work, for it to be properly implemented, the parties in Nepal really do need to federalise. The parties are less democratic and less deliberative than the other cases, and they are far more centralised. The parties did not even see a problem with intervening in the local and provincial levels in, for example, the selection of candidates. And so in terms of getting federalism implemented, I think that this is absolutely one of the key issues. Of course, very, very difficult for political parties to reform themselves, because those who are benefiting from the status quo are the ones that need to make those moves to reform. And I guess when we look at voting patterns, perhaps we might see further shift away from these parties until they do address these issues around decentralization and internal democracy. Thank you.
Insightful presentation. Now, I would like to request election expert Mr. Kåre Vollan to present your paper on the topic Elections, Political Parties and Inclusion, a reflection on the last two general elections in Nepal. Mr. Kåre Vollan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back in Nepal after 5 years. I should just mention that I was here from 2006 till the Constitution in 2015 was established. So I met many of you and I was involved in that process, and I'm trying to, with the paper that I hope you have received, it is a follow-up on previous works on the previous elections. So what I've done for this particular conference is to update the data for the 2022 election. And I'd like to remind you on the CPA. It is 17 years and 1 day since it was entered. And I think that was, and it was the start of the peace process and the process of writing an interim constitution and the final constitution. And to just note the terminology here, because it lists some groups that need to be included in social life and in elections and so on. And it also mentioned the words discrimination, that get away with discrimination. I will come back to why this is quite important. What I'm going to say something about is the elections after the 2015 Constitution in terms of system of representation, political representation, ethnic and groups and castes, and gender. But I will be very brief, and just for the statistics, you please look at the paper. And otherwise, you can follow these colorful PowerPoints. The system of representation was actually decided already in 2006. It should be a mixed system. One should not only have first past the post, which one we're used to, and you know the first past the post, single member constituency, plurality vote. You don't need to have majority. It's enough to have most votes, and it is a big advantage for the biggest or the biggest parties. And I'll come back to how it turned out. So one agreed, no, we need also a proportional element. It is important to have everybody in, to have dialogue, compromise, and so on. And to start with, the discussion was about a 50-50 split between first past the post and proportional. But then there was a big crisis, and the Maoists pressured for more PR, more proportional, and it became 60% proportional, 40% first past the post. But in 2015, this was turned. So it's only now 40% PR and 60% first past the post. It turned out in the last election that Nepali Congress and UML became very, very close in number of votes. UML actually got more votes than Nepali Congress, but Nepali Congress won more seats in first past the post, which happens every now and then. Normally it is the biggest parties, but in this case it was the second one. And then it turned out that the result in the end is actually quite proportional. If you compare the votes with the seats, the total number of seats, it's not a big deviation. But in 2017, it was a much bigger deviation. Then I will concentrate more on the included and excluded groups, because obviously the war was an ideological war, but it was also rooted on a long tradition of discrimination and excluding politics. So it was really about including otherwise excluded groups. And who are they? And that is where I have done a lot of studies on who are actually excluded in terms of elections. And it is not the same as those who are excluded in terms of economy, education, and so on. Obviously, there is a correlation, but it's not a one-to-one correlation. So those who are obviously included would be the hill caste, Bahuns and Chetris, what is called in the constitution now caste area. Those who were obviously excluded were Muslims and Dalits. But Madhesi castes and Janjatis, there you would have groups that were included and groups that were not included. And in my papers, I've used the definition. If a group wins at least 90% of their fair share of the representation, I define them as included. If they get less than that, they are excluded. This definition is, of course, something that one can discuss, but that is what I have been using. And I've gone through all the groups of the census in 2001, 2011, and now I'm using the census of 2021 to see what are the groups and identify them. And it is amazingly stable over time. Before going into more details on that, let me just mention that in the constitution in the interim constitution, there were quotas on the PR, on the proportional side of the election. And in Nepal, very many, when they say proportional election, they don't mean the distribution of seats to parties, which is the normal, the regular definition. They mean proportional representation of Dalits, Janjatis, Madhesis, and so on. And these are the quotas. And in the constitution, it was said that women, Madhesi, Dalits, oppressed Janjatis, backward regions, and others should have their fair share of be represented at least with their proportional share in the PR. And then there was a big discussion, what is others? And some of us thought that would mean other excluded groups, because going back to the CPA, where they list excluded groups only, that was what one would think. So it could be, for example, Muslims, which were not listed here. After a long discussion, the conclusion was no, others meant all other groups. So it meant also the elite. The elite hill castes, they are 30-something%, they should also have their quota. And it meant, and also they introduced a quota for men. So women should have 50% of the seats, of the PR seats, but they could not have 60%. Even though everybody knew that in first past the post they would be vastly underrepresented. So these were exact quotas. Dalits would hardly win one seat in the first past the post. They would still have exactly 13%. They could not have 16% here. So this was carried over to the Constitution in 2015, and now they named all the groups, including, they didn't say others, but they said instead caste area, which means only the high caste. It doesn't mean Dalits. And the one observation is, of course, that some people could fall outside these groups. There aren't many, but there could be some. And there would be more if there are people from outside getting citizenship, and then you cannot run for elections. Let me also say something about quotas, because quotas will always limit the equality of the vote. It will be a restriction to the equality. And that, as you know, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights say elections should be equal, free, universal, and so on. But on the other hand, it is accepted to have deviations from that if it is to promote genuine equality. So that is why affirmative actions for women, for example, is absolutely acceptable where it is needed to create genuine equality. But when also the elite gets a quota, that actually restricts those who are excluded, and it is not a measure to create equality. It is a measure against equality. I just need to check that we are on the same page. So this is actually the result of the analysis, and these are all elections from 1991 till last year on the first past the post, where there is no quotas. So this is a measure on what groups do actually win seats when there are no quotas. And you can see that the figures are very stable. And it turns out that I have not had to adjust who are the groups of the census which are part of these groups, which is actually also quite amazing over time. And as you can see, 46.6% of the population is, per this definition, seen to be excluded, and they have won 12-13% of the votes most of the time. There is one exception, the first CA election, but otherwise 12-14%. So they are grossly underrepresented. And then if we look at the elections that have been held under the mixed system after 2007, it's also quite striking that the result of the quotas and the mixed system is also very stable. So the excluded groups, after we add the PR side, after the quotas, they end up with 20, 21, 22% of the votes, of the seats in parliament. So obviously the PR, it helps, but it doesn't help a lot on the excluded groups, because the quotas are not differentiating between those Janjatis, which are Rai, Newar, Gurungs, five Janjati groups, which are actually always doing well in elections. There are some castes in Madhes which are always doing well in election. And this creamy layer, they are actually picking up most of the seats which are in the quotas. So the quotas could have been much more targeted than what they are. When it comes to gender, it works because it was changed with the new constitution. It says women should have at least 50% of the PR side. It doesn't give a quota for men anymore, and it says it should be at least 1/3 in the whole, in both ways, in the whole house. And then the PR has been used as compensatory seats to achieve that. And this table only shows that for all the parties, it is more or less correct. They do get 33%, obviously, except for independent candidates who are not split by gender. So what happened from 2007 to 15 is actually that the minimum representation of women, according to the rules in 2007, was 28%, and now it is 33%. So it is a slight slight improvement. What are the problems? I've indicated a little bit about what are the problems with the quotas. Well, one is the principle of equality, which I already mentioned. The creamy layers who are picking up the reserved seats. The complexity, it is extremely complex to actually calculate and do the distribution of seats. Minority parties, they need, I mean, if there is a Madesi party, for example, they need to have Hill cast on the list. You argue that that is a good thing, but and maybe it is, but at least it is strange for a party which, for example, are there to promote Dalit rights or OBC rights, that they have to have 30% Hill cast on the list. And it is not very transparent. So the last thing, it is possible to simplify. One way of simplifying is simply to say, we don't need, it is good enough to, no, either we could identify the excluded groups within Madesi caste, Janjatis, Dalits, Muslims, and so on, and give each one a quota. Or one could combine all of them, that is much more radical, and say 46% or 50% of all those elected from PR needs to come from one excluded groups. But we don't care whether it is a Dalit, an OBC, or an excluded Janjati. So that is one way of doing it. One could also actually move to the same arrangement as for women, that one said, actually these groups should have 1/3 of the totality of the House, and use the PR side as some kind of compensatory seats. This is technical, I know that, but doing the same thing as for women, if there isn't 1/3, fill up from the PR side to achieve that. So that's, even if I have 30 seconds left, I will end there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kåre Vollan, for your important presentation. I would like to request Professor Miriam Coronel-Ferrer to give your comments regarding the two presentations within 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Namaste. My comments will highlight two themes that were addressed in the two papers. One has to do with the system of inclusion and representation in the electoral system. The other with regard to party democracy. But first, I'd like to locate the Nepal within a broader context of countries that underwent a transition from conflict to post-conflict. As noted by Mr. Vollan, this is your 17th anniversary, and I don't know if you're still celebrating it or not, but it's certainly a landmark year. And if we go in other parts of Asia, we'll find that there are processes going on similar to what's going on here in East Timor, for example, that got its independence in 2002, first election in 2007, 5 elections that followed after. So in a sense, already some stability achieved, some normalization achieved, and we may say already having moved from transition phase to one that is already no longer a transition, but some kind of a normalized order. And in that sense, that is probably we may say that is the situation in Nepal. And similarly in Aceh, Indonesia, which is, I think in another paper you already got a sense of the electoral system in Indonesia. But in Aceh, it's a special autonomy arrangement. It's not a federal system, neither Indonesia. Indonesia is not a federal system. They're so, attached to their 1945 constitution, which declared Indonesia as a unitary state, even as they actually allowed for special regions. They've had the peace agreement in 2004, and have had several elections afterwards, beginning in 2009 and every 5 years thereafter, except for this period where national policy has suspended elections on the basis of synchronizing all local elections eventually. So what do we see here in these 3 cases, including Nepal? As I pointed out, this is no longer the transition phase. This is more or less the normal phase of politics. Whether that is good or bad, it really depends on the people, how they sort of like take a handle on the situation and ensure that the system that has been created actually works for them. But what's very clear is that across the 3 cases, the elites, the political elites, are still drawn from the same generation, the same people who were part of the process, the peace process. In the case of East Timor, a referendum that led it to its independence. You may say, in fact, that the political parties are sort of veteran parties, except that there is continuity, more continuity in the case of Nepal, having come from that kind of historical juncture where they eventually played a major role in the post-conflict institutional arrangement. In East Timor, there are all 3 countries are multi-parties. And East Timor, they just had their last elections this year. There were 17 parties, but 2 remain dominant, and 3 are sort of trying to make a difference in the electoral outcomes. But otherwise, in terms of voting behavior, you might say, similar here, there are sort of constituencies that are more or less fixed across for these different these political parties, these 2 major political parties. And in the same case in Aceh, where what happened is not so much, is a splintering of the veterans, the elites who led the revolution, into parties, into factions, separate parties, contesting each other for the topmost post. So that's very clear. You see some kind of a foothold of that generation. And the space that opens up now, and the question that opens up now is, what now for the generation change? I think this is something that we must really look into, how we can make sure that the next generation will not reproduce the bad practices that have been entrenched and are still being entrenched, and actually make a difference, however the institutional design may eventually end up, say, 5-10 years from now. So that is probably just an overview of the similarities, and I think it's important to look at your situation from a comparative perspective, because sometimes you get so caught up in your own dynamics, and what you don't see is that kind of some patterns that might be applicable to all cases, and also the same challenges that are faced. Obviously, Nepal is more complicated. In the case of East Timor, it's 1.3 million people with single constituency, no ethnic representation. I guess they wanted to ensure that everyone is like East Timorese, and therefore single constituency. And in the case of Aceh, the direct election for the chief minister of the region, and then parliamentary party system for the houses. So it's really just in Nepal where you have this more kind of mix. I wouldn't call these parties in all 3 cases technically, these dominant parties, as multi-ethnic parties, because it might belie the real nature of these parties. As already mentioned by Dr. Breen, they may be multi-ethnic, but they're actually dominated by certain ethnic groups. And really, it's not about ethnicity that defines them. It's something that is sometimes even unclear what actually defines them, whether it's a political history that they're carrying with them, coming from the struggle, coming from the resistance, Or is it, as in the other panel, distinguished as developmental parties, which may not necessarily be the case? Are these ideological parties, which might not necessarily be the case? So it's really basically a problem as well, how to define the character of these parties, and multi-ethnic might not necessarily sort of give us a good handle for really examining the dynamics across these parties. So interestingly, as we said, it's the three cases are very different. There is, however, a fourth case, and maybe the system of representation here can provide some kind of contrast and similarity in the case of Nepal, and maybe see the merits and demerits, and that is the case of the Bangsamoro in the Philippines, the special autonomous region in the south of our country where we have a dominant Muslim population. I was directly involved in the negotiations. I chaired the government negotiating panel, and we signed the agreement in 2014. But right now, it is still undergoing a transition, but they have come up with an electoral code which has a better division in terms of how the seats are allocated. Mr. Vollan said here, the new constitution really put the division in favor of the FTP, the first past the post parties, right? In our case, we have three categories in the Bangsamoro Electoral Code that has just been passed. We have reserved seats for special sectors, which make up 10% of the seats. And I think that sort of assures that these sectors will have representation, very small. 2 seats for non-Muslim indigenous communities, 2 seats for the migrant population, who are mostly Christians and Catholics, 1 seat for the traditional leaders, another seat for the women, another seat for the youth, and then another, and I think that's about 8 seats, and also more or less they are guaranteed some through the reserved seats. And we have a bigger percentage, 50%, for the proportional representation where only regional parties may compete. So we have national parties, and in this case we have, in this instance, regional parties, which sort of like, the whole idea is to detach them from the politics of the national, because the system has always been to use that as a leverage system, a patronage system coming from the national down to the region, and only for, in effect, only 40% for first past the post on the district level. So thus, do these parties, to what extent are these contexts, these different institutional designs providing the needed inclusion and representation? I think to a certain extent, just like in the preceding panel on inclusion, I think to a certain extent there's really a good basis to really work out the representativeness and inclusiveness of the institutional design. As pointed out, much of the problem is really how these are manipulated and used by the political elites to their advantage, and so on, right? So whether in fact they have party democracy, I am not familiar in the case of Nepal if you do have party laws that has explicit provisions how parties should operate themselves, or in fact they are only they are free how to determine their internal organization. In the case of the Bangsamoro, the electoral code has very strict procedures set up for each party, coming from a tradition where parties are basically personalistic and no real procedure, very undemocratic. So I think it's a lesson being learned from the earlier experiences where in fact the election code provided certain mechanisms on how party democracy shall operate. But then again, whether that will happen in practice, that still remains to be seen, because the first election will still be in 2025. So that is actually a question that I'm asking: what is the institutional parameters for party democracy in the case of Nepal? At the end of the day, the question really is, I think we have already in the last 2 days elaborated on the problems. The real question now is, how do we address these problems? In political science, we have 3 categories which are for political analysis, but it can also be categories for intervention. One is, of course, the institutional design, which means what legislative reforms or even constitutional amendments may happen in the future. One has to do with agency, because as we already mentioned, a large part of the problem are the political agents, especially those at the political class who are so used to certain behavior and therefore have brought this into the new institutional design. So what interventions there might be necessary, and then also on the ideational, the 3rd category, on the normative aspects, how do we build on the positive norms that can really build this? And I think civil society organizations, the mass media, watchdogs watching over these parties, and also the critical elements in each of the different parties, they are very crucial in precisely being able to address these deficiencies and pave the way for real democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miriam, for your valuable comments. अब सहभागीको तर्फबाट केवल 3वटा प्रश्न मात्र हामी लिन्छौँ. केवल प्रश्न एकजनाले एउटा प्रश्न मात्र सोधिदिनु होला.
Thank you. Hello, sir and ma'am. My name is Pushpa Dangal, and I'm a BLB 4th year student in Kathmandu School of Law. So my question is, it's regarding page number 13 of the paper of Mr. Vollan. If everyone in the audience can follow me in the page number 13. So there, it's titled Gender Representation per Party in Both Races in the 2022 election. If you are with me, Mr. Vollan. Page number 13, if you are with me. 13. So there, okay. So there, in the first past the post method, if we see the number, there are just 4 female in the CPN UML and 40 male. And again, if we see from the Nepali Congress, there's just 1 female contesting for the direct election, that is from the first past the post system, and there is like 56 male. And if we see the proportional representation part,
यसमा क्वेशन के हो? क्वेशन गर्नु न है. अलि लामो
question,
के हो
मैले यहाँबाट के देखाउन खोजेको भने, women are not trusted to run for the direct election. Even if they want to, they are not given that opportunity. So can we call it an inclusion? I think it is a sheer level of discrimination, and maybe we can term it as superficial inclusion. So I just wanted to know his take on this. Yeah, thank you.
मेरो नाम प्रमोद पोखरेल, म गाउँपालिका राष्ट्रिय वडा प्रतिनिधित्व गर्छु र मैले यो समानुपातिक निर्वाचन प्रणालीको विषयमा कार्यपत्रमा केही कुराहरू आएको छ र यो जुन संविधानको मर्म भावना अनुसार जुन समानुपातिक प्रणालीमा दलित, महिला, अल्पसंख्यक, पछाडी पारिएका र पछाडी परेका समुदायहरूलाई समेट्ने भनेर निर्वाचन प्रणालीमा तपाईको समानुपातिक निर्वाचन प्रणाली राखियो र पोलिटिकल पार्टीका लिडरहरूले त्यसलाई त्यसमा प्रयोग नगरेर आफन्तहरूको प्रतिकेन्द्रको रूपमा प्रयोग गर्दाखेरि अहिले संघीय संरचनामाथि नै यो तपाईको चाहिँ प्रश्न उठ्ने, आलोचना गर्ने एउटा पद्धतिको विकास भएको छ। यसको हल गर्न यो तपाईको चाहिँ निर्वाचन प्रणालीले 2 थरी समस्या सिर्जना गर्यो। एउटा त पोलिटिकल पार्टीहरूले बहुमतै नल्याउने
हैन, प्रश्न हो कि हजुरको
प्रश्न हो। मेरो प्रश्न अन्तिम हुन थाल्यो। बहुमतै ल्याउन नसक्ने। अर्को कुरा तपाईको जुन समुदायका लागि भनेर छुट्याइएको हो समानुपातिक निर्वाचन प्रणालीबाट समुदाय समेटिनु पर्थ्यो, त्यो नसमेटेर आफन्तहरूको भर्ती केन्द्र बनाइयो। यसलाई कसरी सुधार गर्न सकिन्छ भन्ने विषयमा यहाँहरुको धन्यवाद।
लास्ट वान, अब एकजना।
Hello, Philip Kåre. I just want to make a maybe Michael Breen can respond. Thank you for your paper. I would like to give a word of encouragement to my Nepalese friends. Malaysia went through 60 over years of a institution left behind by the British to some extent. And understand these contestations that we are hearing in Nepal arose very, very acutely the last decade. In the last GE14, we found a replacement of a coalition government, and it was a peaceful transition. I think that whilst we have these passionate arguments whether it is working, we should be encouraged that once we have a normative constitution, and if the constitutional organs would begin to have conversations and have harmony together, like Malaysia, you too would make that transition. I think that you have paid it in blood. There's a great verse from Auden, the cement of democracy is cemented in blood. You all have done so. Malaysia did not have blood, but we too are negotiating. And I want to end one more sentence. The constitutional patriotism is what we need to encourage, and a concept that can weld together these various contesting ideas. Thank you very much.
धन्यवाद सबै प्रश्नकर्ताज्यूहरूलाई. I like to request Mr. Kåre Vollan to respond to the queries.
Thank you for the questions, and they are very good. Therefore, I cannot answer them. But what can be done to trust women to run in first past the post? It's very, very important. And the one question is, of course, with the quotas on PR, does that give incentives for parties to put women in winnable constituencies as well, or does it have the opposite effect? And I am not sure. I do think that the parties would like to be able to put their leaders in safe places in PR. And if they put more women in first past the post and they are elected, they will be able to have more male high caste in the PR. So the incentives can go both ways, but we had a discussion during lunch and about this, and earlier there was, in the 90s, there was a requirement that parties needed to have 5 or 10% women candidates in first past the post. And that is, of course, one way of doing it, to say you need to have 30% women. But would they then put the women in the places where they win, or where they were certain to lose? I think very much of this has to do with political culture. It will take time, but I do think it is important to build capacity of those elected locally and in parliament, and to really become good representatives, regardless whether they are from first past the post or PR or whatever. That is very important, and it will take some time. But there are things that can be done. But it is not good to see the statistics. I agree with you. And the same, when PR was first introduced, I don't think it was because of being inclusive of groups. I think actually, to start with, it was to have a proportional election in the distribution between parties. But it very soon became also the mantra of proportionality between groups. And again, it has to do with political maturity, maturity. Whether they use the PR to just put family members or other token representatives, has been mentioned in some other presentation today. I think over time, parties will not really want to have tokens. The one possibility to make it closer to the voters is to, for example, say the PR seats should be distributed to province lists of PR. In Germany, they have something similar. So instead of having one very long national list, you could have lists of candidates for each province, and people would know them and would be able to see, oh, here they are really cheating, if you like, when they set up candidates. So there are things that can be done, but you are absolutely right. This is something that should be developed.
Thank you, Mr. Vollan, for your response. I'd like to request Dr. Michael to respond to the questions.
Okay, thank you. I know the first question wasn't for me, but I asked this question of many of my interview participants quite directly, is why are women and Dalits and other excluded minorities not being put forward in first past the post seats, including to Dalit and women politicians, and they were quite open and said that we don't run women Dalits in these seats because people don't vote for us because of ingrained discrimination, and so they just see it as a fait accompli. There will be an inevitable loss, which is very sad, but this is one of the cultural issues. And so to go to, I think, Philip's point, was very insightful. And Malaysia has a longer history of democracy, and it also has this culture of elite deliberation. And so it's run its system of government to an extent in a kind of consociational way with coalitions of ethnic parties in the main. And really only now are we seeing these larger multi-ethnic parties taking a prominent place in government. And so a lot of cultural factors are very, very important, as has come out in the comments and the questions. A couple of quotes from my paper that I would read. We are naturally very expressive and take issues personally. Sometimes for us it is a decision of life or death. Or here, the culture is very passionate, so we have lots of argumentation. It is different in the city. And so those cultural factors really do affect how parties actually operate. And when you have this like hierarchical caste-based traditions, then those traditions get reflected internally in the parties. And the other thing is that Malaysia has accepted coalition governments as basically standard practice, whereas here I think coalition governments are still very much frowned upon, and we heard arguments today for more presidential style elections so that the government can have secure tenures for 5 years or more. But when you do comparisons, presidential systems tend to perform worse on virtually every metric. Coalition governments are better for power sharing, which is more important in ethnically diverse societies. And when you combine them with mixed or proportional representation electoral systems, you can really encourage the formation of more stable coalitions. And I actually think that the mix of the electoral system here in Nepal is really good, because it creates some bigger parties, but they rarely cross that threshold for forming a majority in their own right, and this requires other parties to join. And so this is like the Indian sort of situation, notwithstanding the increasing dominance of the BJP, which is causing some problems there. But basically the major parties for quite some time were not able to get a majority. And so they need to bring in those smaller regional and ethnic parties. And I think that that's a good thing for democratic federalism.
Thank you, Dr. Michael, for your response. अब हामी करिब कार्यक्रमको अन्तमा आएका छौँ। अब समयले पनि धेरै पर गइसकेको छ। मसँग पनि 5 मिनेट भए तापनि म 3 मिनेटमै यो सक्नेछु, किनकि 2-3 वटा पोइन्ट मात्रै मैले भन्नै पर्छ भन्ने मलाई लागेको छ। दुवै प्रस्तोताहरूबाट प्रस्तुतिकरणमा समावेश भएका विषय वस्तु र सुझावले नेपालको संघीयता, समावेशिता, संस्थागत संरचना र सहभागितामूलक दृष्टिकोणको बारेमा साझा बुझाइमा एकरूपता ल्याउन मद्दत पुग्ने विश्वास मैले लिएको छु। त्यसै गरेर डाक्टर माइकलले नेपालको संघीय संरचनाको सूक्ष्म ज्ञान प्रदान गरेका छन् भने संघीयतालाई सुदृढ गर्न राजनीतिक दलहरूको भूमिकालाई पनि जोड दिएका छन्। नेपालमा संघीयताको ढाँचाभित्र समावेशी संसदलाई केन्द्रीकृत गर्दै बोलानको अनुसन्धान पनि उत्तिकै प्रभावकारी रहेको छ। विविधता, समावेशिता प्रतिनिधित्वका विषय निरन्तर छलफल अन्तर्क्रिया हुनुपर्छ भन्ने उहाँको सुझाव रहेको छ। भोलानबाट नेपालको वर्तमान कोटा प्रणालीको विकल्पका रूपमा प्रस्तुत गरिएका सुझावका विषयमा थप अध्ययन गर्न जरुरी देखिन्छ भने डाक्टर ब्रिनको जातीय बहुजातीय राजनीतिक दलहरूमा आन्तरिक लोकतन्त्र र विचार विमर्श सम्बन्धी निष्कर्षहरू पनि त्यत्तिकै महत्त्वपूर्ण देखिन्छ र टिप्पणीकर्ताको सुझाव त्यत्तिकै मननयोग्य पनि रहेको छ र यसले हामीलाई भविष्यमा यस विषयमा थप अध्ययन गर्नको लागि मार्ग प्रशस्त भएको मेरो ठम्याइरहेको छ। अन्तमा सुशासन र निर्वाचनसँग सम्बन्धित महत्त्वपूर्ण विषयहरूमा हुने संवादलाई निरन्तर दिने जुन काठमाडौँ विश्वविद्यालय स्कुल अफ लको प्रयत्न छ त्यसको लागि म धन्यवाद दिन चाहन्छु। यस कार्यक्रमलाई सफल बनाउन कार्यपत्र प्रस्तोताज्यू, टिप्पणीकर्ताज्यूहरू र यहाँ उपस्थित सम्पूर्ण महानुभावहरू सबैलाई धैर्यताका साथ सुनिदिनु भयो, सुझाव राखिदिनु भयो, त्यसको लागि पुनः धन्यवाद दिँदै हामीहरूको कलेक्टिभ इफोर्ट्सले मात्रै हाम्रो परिकल्पना गरेको लक्ष्य प्राप्त गर्न सम्भव हुन्छ भन्ने सन्देशको प्रवाह गर्दै आजको यो सत्र यही अन्त भएको म जानकारी गराउँछु। धन्यवाद।